I'm Warren Hogue, IPI's Senior Advisor for External Relations, and I'm happy to welcome you to this Distinguished Author Series event featuring Tarek Masoud, co-author of The Arab Spring, Pathways of Repression and Reform. Tarek is the actually newly named, for which we should congratulate him, Sultan of Oman, Associate Professor of International Relations at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. And he is speaking tonight on behalf of himself and the book's two other co-authors, Jason Brownlee, who is Associate Professor of Government and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Texas, and Andrew Reynolds, Associate Professor of Political Science and Chair of Global Studies at the University of North Carolina. I had been thinking that I wanted this month's book to be about the Arab Spring. Last month, those of you who were here will recall, we did ISIS. And I chose to pursue this one after running into the review from Fareed Zakaria that I put in the invitation, quote, "This is quite simply the best analysis of the Arab Spring that I have read." Several of my scholarly IPI colleagues have since seconded that judgment. As the backgrounds of the three authors suggest, this is a thoughtful and carefully researched analysis. Their not unexpected, but still despairing conclusion is that, quote, "the Arab Spring has yielded a depressingly modest harvest." But that doleful conclusion is also something of a starting point for the authors. Why and how this happened and whether it is destined to, again, is the business of this book. We all have our recollections of the high hopes that the beginning of the Arab Spring in 2011 provoked. For many of us here at IPI, we remember in particular the visit to this stage in November of 2011 of Ahmed Maher, the charismatic 31-year-old founder of the April 6th youth movement that advocated democracy in Egypt. So giddy and high-spirited with the possibilities of the spreading uprisings was he that day that he showed up a little late, explaining with delight that on the way here, he had been drawn into the Occupy Wall Street protest downtown. We asked him to compare what he saw with what he was experiencing in Egypt, and he said, quote, "I think the similarity is the youth, the spirit, the hope of change." That was then. 2 years later, Ahmed Maher was arrested and charged with violating a law banning protests. And today he is serving a 3-year jail sentence in Cairo, much of it in solitary confinement. In a letter he smuggled out of prison last year, you can hear... Oh, you're not hearing me? It says it's on. It's not on? Are you not hearing me in the back? Can you hear me now? Okay. I won't go back and repeat it all. But I was just telling the story of Ahmed Maher, who was here, who is now in jail. And in a letter that he smuggled out of prison last year, you can hear the disillusionment he felt at the outcome, and it sounds almost quaint now. Quote, "I met with some of the most famous and important figures of Europe, America, India, Korea, and Turkey," he wrote, "and here I am now looking for a loaf of stale bread to eat." What had begun as stirring popular mobilization was to descend into civil war, state failure, authoritarian renewal, and much too often the deaths of participants. Now, rather than go on with a few more comments about this, I want to turn it over to Tarek to tell you about the book. The book, by the way, is for sale outside, and I will make sure we get done here by about 7:15 so that you'll have time to purchase it and have a chat with him, and he can sign the books. So without further ado, please welcome Tarek Masoud.
All right. Thank you, Warren, for that introduction. I just literally got off the plane, so there's the slides are stable now. Okay, good. You know, Warren did not mention this. My first job out of college, I worked for Warren's brother at Foreign Affairs magazine. And if you've ever met Warren's brother, he looks exactly like Robert Redford, except a little bit more handsome. Okay. And so does Warren. No, okay. All right, so this book is entitled, imaginatively entitled The Arab Spring, Pathways of Repression and Reform, and it just came out with Oxford. And I wrote it with these two wonderful white gentlemen, Jason Brownlee, and why don't we keep the lights on? Because I don't want people to fall asleep and, you know. Jason Brownlee and Andy Reynolds, and we first started writing this book in December of 2011. So after, you know, the Arab Spring had begun, but long before we even had the vaguest glimmer of a sense of how this season, the Arab Spring, would end. And we did not expect it to end the way, or to at least, you know, by 2014 or 2015, where we are right now, to look the way it does, right? We were actually quite optimistic, despite being sometimes crotchety academics. This slide is intended to illustrate the full scope of the disappointment of the Arab Spring. It is a slide that is probably only immediately intelligible to the person who made it, i.e. me, but let me try to explain what it's showing. So this is, these are Arab countries, and I have graphed their Freedom House scores. So Freedom House is this organization that goes around and ranks countries based on how democratic they are, how much they have in the way of political rights, and how much they have in the way of civil liberties. They put together an aggregate score. This score is from 2 to 14. If you score low in this particular test, it's actually good. If you score high, it's very bad. What I did was I made a chart where I reversed the scale so that it looks intelligible. And what we find is basically the story of the Arab Spring has been primarily one of stasis, right? So countries like Algeria, no change at all. Countries like Jordan, no change at all. And then to the extent that we see change, it has been change in a bad direction. Places like Bahrain, Syria, countries have generally been considered by Freedom House to have become less free over the course of the Arab Spring. One country, Libya, had actually managed to find itself in more free territory, but in the recent update, the folks at Freedom House have determined that Libya should be in the not free category. I would even argue that this is an overly optimistic estimate of where Libya is, because it's no longer a question of whether Libya is democratic or undemocratic. It's a question of whether there's a thing called Libya at all. So if we look at the entire landscape of the Arab world, there is only one place that has emerged as anything resembling a liberal democracy, and that is tiny little Tunisia on the shores of the Mediterranean, 10 million people, and it is the Arab world's only liberal democracy. It is the only success story of the Arab Spring, and the central obsession of this book is to explain why. So this is just showing you the same thing. So basically what this book does is it starts by trying to understand or trying to answer two questions. First of all, why is it that the protests, the thing that we thought made the Arab Spring, these uprisings, why is it that they only happened in a small subset of countries? Because after all, they didn't happen everywhere. The Arab Spring that resides in the popular imagination, this vast uprising that stretched all the way from Casablanca to Cairo and beyond, actually didn't touch a whole lot of places. So of all of the Arab countries, we only actually see protests that challenge regimes, that challenge authoritarian regimes in 6 places. These are Bahrain, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Tunisia, and Yemen. And in those 6 places, the uprisings actually only succeed, and here we have a very limited definition of success, which we mean they compel the resignation of the dictator. They only succeed in 4 places, and then only in one of those 4 places, Tunisia, do we actually get democracy. So that's what the book tries to explain. And in this talk, I'm going to try to basically animate the book and hopefully get you all to read the book by framing some of the questions, or by trying to get you to be as puzzled by the Arab Spring as me and my co-authors were when we started studying this. So we're going to ask two big questions. The first is, what explained the success or failure of uprisings, and then why did democracy fail to take root except in Tunisia? Okay, so what explains uprising success and failure? There are a wealth of standard narratives here, correct? So we hear, for example, that the uprisings took place and succeeded because the grievances of the people could just no longer be ignored. Another speaks about the role of information technology, that in fact the Arab Spring was the result of a particular moment in human history where there was a confluence between grievance and the ability of people finally using this new information technology, Facebook, Twitter, etc., to actually organize and overcome authoritarian regimes. And then finally, a third, less romantic argument is that the endpoints of the Arab Spring, whether a regime fell or did not fall, really resided with the military. The military of the respective countries, those were the actors that made the decisions that determined whether leaders would rise or fall, and therefore the entirety of our analytic focus should be on what militaries did. So let me talk about each of these in turn. Okay, so what we try to do in our book is actually adjudicate among these explanations. We try to give you the correct answer that doesn't exist in the study of politics, but nonetheless we tried to do it. So the first is this argument about grievances. And there are a couple of grievances, right, that people often talk about when they talk about the Arab Spring, the things that animated the Arab Spring. The first is the fact that you had these really long-standing dictators in this part of the world. I mean, the Arab dictators were world champions at staying in power. So we have Hosni Mubarak, for example, here. Even he looks tired here. 30 years of continuous rule. Ali Abdullah Saleh of Yemen, 34 years. By comparison, Zain al-Abidin bin Ali looks like a comparative youngster, having spent 22 years in power. The champion of champions, of course, was Muammar Gaddafi, who had been in power for 42 years. And it's not just that these people had been in power for a very long time. It is that there was abroad in the land this idea, this sense that they were gearing up to pass power to their sons. Okay? So that republics were becoming pseudo-monarchies. And the best example of this is in Egypt, where many observers thought that Camel Mubarak, the son of Hosni Mubarak, sort of young, AUC, Western educated guy, was being groomed to take over in Egypt. I actually don't think he was. I also think it would have been better had he done so, given what's happened since. In Libya, there's a little bit more evidence that this was happening. This is Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, the son of Muammar Gaddafi, who was also being groomed for leadership. And then, of course, we know that the kind of quintessential example of this hereditary succession was in Syria, where, in fact, Syria's current leader was the son of the previous leader, Hafez al-Assad. So there was a sense that our leaders have been in power for a really long time, and B, they're going to be with us for the foreseeable future because they're going to pass power to their sons. This is a depressing state of affairs. So that's one set of grievances. The other set of grievances, of course, that we constantly heard about was the enormous brutality of these regimes against their citizens. So in the Egyptian case, you remember the case of Khalid Said, a young man who lived in Alexandria, who was killed by some police officers, or the case of Mohammed Bouazizi in Tunisia, whose self-immolation was considered by many people, not actually the co-authors, me and my co-authors, but considered by many people to be the spark that lit the Arab Spring. Why did he set himself on fire? Because he was abused by one of the agents of the state, an official in the municipal government. So there's this idea that the states did not at all respect the bodily integrity of their citizens, and that this state of affairs had to change, right? The other set of grievances, so we have longstanding dictators going to pass power to their sons and with their boots on our necks constantly. The other set of grievances is that, look, maybe we would have tolerated all of these things had there actually been economic development and vitality. But in fact, on the contrary, as we know, the Arab world was not a region of tremendous economic growth. There was still a great deal of poverty. Nobody, after all, was talking about the Arab tigers or the Egyptian model or anything other than the security realm. This is just a map of World Bank income groups showing that most Arab countries are lower middle income countries. They have been for a very long time. And the only Arab countries that are actually pretty wealthy are those that happen to have been blessed with oil. This is a better illustration of just how the economic structures in the Arab world created grievance. This is the World Bank, the World Bank's measure of control of corruption. So the World Bank actually measures how well countries are at controlling corruption, and this is based on the perceptions of businessmen and a whole bunch of measures. And basically, what we see is that all of it's a scale that goes from minus 2.5 to 2.5. So Hong Kong, for example, is up here at 2. And most Arab countries were considered actually to be quite corrupt, right? So there's this sense that the economy is not growing, and to the extent that there are some benefits to economic activity, they are not accruing to the broad citizenry. They are going to cronies of the regime. This is a hugely corrupt set of systems. And this is a problem particularly with young people. So again, another thing that we would have heard is that young people in the Arab world lack opportunity. Young people lack opportunities for employment. And this is in fact a chart showing you this, that youth unemployment in the Arab world was pretty high. If you compare the Middle East and North Africa to other regions of the world, it has the highest youth unemployment in the world, okay? And this is a huge problem. This is just another illustration of this. So this basically chart is a chart I made that shows the median age in a bunch of Arab countries, and then I compare them to China, United States, and Japan. Can anybody tell me what the median age is here? Pardon? Median? No. Tell me what the word median, what does the word median mean? I can call on somebody. Exactly. Okay. Most of my students say it means average, and so then I get to pretend to be really smart. Okay, so the median age is the age at which half of the population is younger than you and half of the population is older than you, okay? In Yemen, the median age is around 16 years old. So think about that. Half of the people in Yemen are younger than 16. In the United States, we're around 37. I recently, a couple of years ago now, passed the median age, so I'm feeling very old. The point here is that youth unemployment is a huge problem because most of the populations of these countries are young, okay? And this is particularly a problem because of this chart. So what is this chart trying to show us? Okay, this chart is trying to show us the cost of getting married in Egypt, okay? So remember, I'm talking now about youth unemployment and why youth unemployment is such a big problem. Okay. This is a chart of the cost of getting married in Egypt, and basically the way that they have calculated the cost of getting married is, or the way they've presented it here, is as a multiple of per capita GDP. So and this on the y-axis here is your income group in society. So this bar here represents the richest 20% of Egyptians, okay? So we survey the richest 20% of Egyptians, and we want to know how much their average wedding costs. This is just the party, okay? So the average wedding for the richest 20% of Egyptians costs 8 times per capita GDP, average per capita GDP. So if per capita GDP in Egypt in nominal terms is about $3,000, it's a bit more than that. This is 8 times 3,000, 24. The party for the richest 20% costs about $24,000. Not a big bill for them, right? For the poorest 20%, the cost of the party still costs more than 2.5 times average per capita GDP. So, you know, almost $9,000 or around $8,000, okay? This is a lot of money. Okay? This is a huge amount of money for these young people to have to raise in order to be able to get married, right? I mean, you'd have to work for 2.5 years and save every single penny in order to get married. Now, you may be thinking, so who cares? Well, they don't need to get married. People in New York aren't getting married and they're living totally fine. But you've got to remember that these are traditional societies. And so, in fact, marriage is the sole or main avenue through which citizens have access to a very important human need, which is sex, right? So you can read this chart, which is the percent of people who have never been married by age group in Egypt, as percent of people who have never had sex, okay? And then if you think about it that way, then it's no wonder that the Arab world erupted into protests. Now, here's the upshot of this little bit of the discussion. So there are lots of grievances. It's very clear there were tons of grievances, but they were long-standing grievances. So to point out grievance doesn't help us answer the question, right? There is, they've been there for a long time, so why now? Why did, at this particular moment, these grievances erupt and actually shake regimes? Okay, so then that shifts our focus to information technology. People will respond to us and say, well, it's because at this particular moment in history, we had access to a kind of technology that would allow people to organize, that allowed people to overcome the efforts of authoritarian regimes to prevent them from rising up against them. So this is the idea that the Arab Spring was made by this guy. Okay. So the argument here, there's a good book by Howard and Hussein where they argue that these new information technologies allegedly allowed oppositions to surmount what we in political science call the collective action problem. Just means it's really hard to act collectively, to act together in pursuit of a particular goal. Okay. And this idea that the revolutions are made by technology, this is a long-standing kind of old idea. It's almost any time there's a revolution, there is a corresponding argument that that revolution was made by the technology that exists at this particular moment in time. Okay, so this is a quote I pulled up from George H.W. Bush, one of my favorite presidents, actually, who shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall made the argument that, in fact, this past year in the revolution of '89, we've seen communication satellites, video cameras, VCRs, fax machines becoming a potent VCRs. I mean, just think about that, okay. So, and this sets off a wondrous, hopeful political chain reaction worldwide. Okay. So look, I mean, just because George Bush said it doesn't mean it's not true. So we have to try to bring some data to this question. And one of the things we do is we look at rates of internet usage by country. Okay, so the World Values Survey, which is this big operation that tries to measure all kinds of things about people's attitudes all over the world, they ask people, how often do you use the internet? And answers can range from every day to, once a week, etc., all the way to never. Okay, and we find actually a lot of variation in rates of internet usage in the Arab world. Okay, so in Egypt, for example, most people don't use the internet, and this data actually is validated by other data that I've collected in Egypt over the years. I've never done a survey in Egypt where more than 9–10% of people say that they use the internet on a daily basis. Okay. So lots of variation here, but if we look at the countries where we had uprisings of this is the only countries for which we have data, unfortunately. But if we look at the countries for which we have data, we see that Egypt, low rate of internet penetration and yet uprising. Yemen. I mean, who in their right minds would argue that in Yemen, a country that is really quite underdeveloped, that the internet is what made the revolution against Ali Abdullah Saleh? Tunisia, in fact, maybe in Tunisia it matters. But the point here is that we can't endogenize this, or we can't explain this phenomenon with reference to this particular variable, because the variation in this variable doesn't match what happened in the real world. So. And I've got all kinds of other information too, but I'm going to race through it because we don't have a lot of time. So the best data suggests we can't really explain this with reference to the internet. Right? Okay, so Then the intellectual exertions of scholars have shifted because it's so hard to explain the demand side, to explain what people were doing and what caused people to actually go out and take to the streets and finally organize. We've shifted our focus to trying to explain how regimes reacted to those uprisings, right? And we particularly focus on the behaviors of the militaries in reaction to these uprisings. So the idea becomes, well, we don't really know why these things happened. I mean, there's a confluence of factors, but where it succeeded or where it failed was all entirely determined by how the military behaved. Okay, and basically, there's a large literature and a growing literature. I mean, arguing that the revolutions really only succeed when the military chooses to defect from the ruling regime. And the reason that or the kind of military that is going to defect from the regime and say to the regime, you know what, the people are rising up against you, we will side with the people as opposed to siding with you. Well, the kind of military that's going to do that is typically a professional and institutionalized military that can see for itself a life beyond this particular regime. And so in this telling, okay, so we've got these 6 countries that had uprisings, and in 4 of them, the uprisings succeed, right? Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen. The argument here would somehow be that these militaries in those 4 countries were somehow more professional or institutionalized. But of course, if you know anything about the militaries in those countries, it's not at all the case, right? So Yemen, for example, certainly did not have a professional military. Yemen has a highly tribalized military in which key components of that military are controlled by family members of the ousted dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh. Right? Libya had, in fact, Libya experienced a defection from some senior military officers defected very early, such as Abdel Fattah Yunus. Others did not. It didn't really have much of a military to speak of to begin with, and a high degree of reliance on mercenaries. So it seems to me that the explanation, I mean, clearly the militaries do matter. If we look at what happened in Egypt or Tunisia, clearly the behavior of the military mattered. In Tunisia, the military decides not to be the backstop of the regime. In Egypt, the military hems and haws for a little bit, but finally also decides not to be the backstop of the regime. But of course, those 2 militaries are very different from each other as well. So there's clearly something about the military, but it's not as simple as how institutionalized or non-institutionalized or how professional the military is. So the existing accounts are of limited value. So what is the answer? So I've never given a book talk before. This is my 2nd book. And, or I've never given a book talk to a general audience. My first book is this kind of I love the book, but it's very mathematical. And so I've only spoken about it to political scientists. So there you will tell them, like, what do we argue? But here I actually want this book to sell. So I'm not going to tell you what the answer is. But hopefully now you are gripped. You want to know what we have cleared the existing landscape of explanations, and now your minds are primed for the contribution of myself and my co-authors. Okay, so I think the existing literature doesn't really help us understand what happened, and hopefully our book will get us further there. The second question, which I want to spend more of our time on, is, and this is in fact a more important question because it's a question of much more current interest, is why did democracy fail to take root in those 4 places? So we've got 4 success cases. Why did democracy fail to take root except in Tunisia? So here are the 4 success cases. And basically what we do here is we kind of try to break down this problem into its constituent components. So this is people are looking unhappily at this. I'm very proud of this slide. Okay, so basically what I've tried to do is break down the Arab Spring into its constituent components. So we start with uprisings, and let's assume that these uprisings basically are more or less random. There's a kind of contagion, it sweeps across the Arab world, and the uprisings hit a lot of different places. But only in 4 places do we see regime breakdown, right? Only in 4 places is the dictator compelled to resign as a result of popular protest, okay? Those are places where we're going to say a democratic transition has been initiated, Okay? Democratic transition has begun. The question then is, did the democratic transition get completed, right? Now, usually when we talk about democratic transitions, we talk not about democratic transition completion, we talk about democratic transition consolidation, right? This is the idea that democracy becomes well-rooted, all political elites become habituated to democracy. That is a very high bar that we're not going to be able to reach yet, because these are all new democracies. So for us, we apply the much lower and much more forgiving standard of completion. And a completed democratic transition, which in the literature basically, is one in which you've got elections that bring to power a government that actually governs, okay? Very low bar. So basically an elected government that actually is the government, okay? So in the Arab Spring, shortly after the revolutions and shortly after these breakdowns, we start to see elections, right? So Tunisia had legislative or constituent assembly elections in October of 2011. Egypt had its parliamentary elections from November to January 2011. Libya had elections in the summer of 2012. The only country that, in fact, did not have elections, and in fact, to this day has not had elections, is Yemen. Okay? Now, somebody sitting here who's spent a lot of time in Yemen is going to say, well, no, wait a minute, Yemen did have an election. The current president of Yemen, well, I don't know if he's the current president anymore. The de facto, or the nominal president of Yemen is a guy named Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi, and he, in fact, was elected in February 2012. Except he was elected in an election in which he was the only candidate. Okay? So in Yemen, there has not been a multi-party election. By the way, who was he? He was the vice president of the former dictator, which begins to give you a sense of what we're going to say about Yemen. Did it complete its democratic transition? If you're all betting people, you'd bet what? No. Okay. So we've got three countries that actually managed to have an election. The question then becomes, so that's only one part of this, right? That's only one part of this equation. Did you have an election that brought a government to power? The second question is, could that government actually govern, right? We could all have an election in this room for the government of the Republic of Graustark or whatever, but we would not actually have the authority to rule that land because we have no connection to what happens there. And so the question for us is, if you have, there's something happened with this slide, but it's okay. If you had an election, is this newly elected government actually able to govern? And so what we've done here, my co-authors and I, we've actually charted the World Bank's government effectiveness indicator. Okay? And basically, this is the World Bank's measure of how strong the state is. How much capacity does the state have to govern? And it starts in 1995. We graph it all the way, I think, to 2011, where the last year for which we were able to get data. And you see a couple of things. The first thing you see is that of these 4 cases of regime change, Tunisia, for a long time, has had what people have considered to be the most competent or effective state in the Arab world. Okay? This is a hugely important fact that we often forget. Okay? Tunisia looks very different from Egypt. Egypt's line disappeared here. I don't know why. But anyways, Egypt's line would be about here. So Egypt is less than Tunisia in terms of its effectiveness. And then way at the bottom, we have Libya and Yemen. Okay? Yemen has already dropped out of our analysis because they didn't have an election. Libya had an election, but the argument we make is that its government was never able to govern. Okay? That was a country that from the beginning, from the outset, lacked an effective or capable state. And the reason Libya lacked an effective or capable state was because that was the policy of the previous dictator, Muammar Gaddafi. So I don't know if anybody here has read Muammar Gaddafi's book, The Green Book, which is his little political manifesto, but this book is littered with testimonials to the evil that is the state. Right? To the extent that Gaddafi had a political philosophy, it was to dismantle the state. And this was, of course, as Dirk Van de Waal of Dartmouth College has argued, it wasn't because he was a dyed-in-the-wool believing anarchist. It was because he thought if you had a very weak state, you could keep people atomized, prevent rivals from emerging. But we see all kinds of testimonials to this in Gaddafi's political ideology. This is why, for example, Libya did not have an army. Right? Did not have a national army because Gaddafi did not, or a big national army, because Gaddafi did not want a challenger to his rule. The problem is that when you then overthrow Gaddafi, you as the ascendant Democrats have very little in the way of a state to actually use to govern this territory. So even though you had elections, you'd never had a strong enough state to actually transmit the result of that election into actual government policy. And so Libya has almost from the very beginning devolved into a kind of militia politics, right? And so we would argue that Libya did not complete its democratic transition, even though it did have something called the government of Libya, whose prime minister could be kidnapped by various militias. So it was, the problem in Libya is an utter lack of state capacity. So that then leaves us with Tunisia and Egypt, okay? And the question is, does Egypt count as a completed democratic transition? Okay. Now, it's not clear that it does, right? It's not clear that Egypt counts as a completed democratic transition because, as we know, in January of 2012, after Egypt's parliamentary election was completed, they then, in May to June of 2012, had presidential elections. Okay? And the winner of that presidential election was a man named Mohammed Morsi, who I actually wrote a big chunk of my doctoral dissertation about. He was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a conservative religious political party in Egypt. And right before Mohammed Morsi was elected, the legislature that had been elected a few months prior was dissolved by the Supreme Constitutional Court of Egypt. Okay? So even though you had a president who was now newly elected, you lost the legislature, right? So at this point, even by the time Morsi is elected, you still don't have a government that in its entirety is elected. Now, Egypt did not go without a legislature after Morsi was elected, but does anybody know what the legislature was after Morsi was elected? It was the army. The army declared itself the legislative authority in Egypt after Mohammed Morsi was elected. Okay? Now, good or bad, whatever you want to say about that, I'm not making a moral judgment. I'm just saying that by the standard of a completed democratic transition, Egypt didn't make it, right? Now, some people might say that there was a particular moment in time where Egypt did have both an elected executive and an elected legislature. When was that? That was, people might say, August 2012, after Mohammed Morsi cashiered the Minister of Defense and got the military to agree to hand over legislative authority to the president. So there was a period where the president, who was after all elected, was also the legislature. And I guess if you were being really narrow-minded or very pedantic, you could say, well, at that particular point in time, Egypt completed its democratic transition, but you'd have to have had several stiff drinks to come to that conclusion, right? What it suggests to us is that Egypt actually never completed the transition, right? It never got to where Tunisia got in October of 2011. Okay. Now, what happens in Egypt? Let's say, for example, we're willing to grant that after the president is elected and after he's able to wrest legislative authority from the military, that in fact you do have now a democratically elected government. What we know is that government doesn't last, right? We know that in the Egypt, so this brings us to the third phase, which we're not going to call consolidation, we'll call maintenance, right? And here the question becomes, why is it that in Egypt in July 2013, there was a military coup and Tunisia did not suffer that same fate, right? Tunisia has actually managed to hold on to its fledgling democratic institutions despite the existence of social cleavages, of discontent, of unrest that was every bit as volatile as what we saw in Egypt. So our question then narrows now to trying to explain, why is it that democracy persisted here but died there? Okay. And so lots of people will give you answers that, again, reorient our focus on the military and on the role of the military in these two different countries. Does anybody know who this is? This is Habib Bourguiba, the founder of the modern Tunisian state, came to power in 1957 and was deposed in 1987. And he's dressed in these resplendent garments here. He was a lawyer, okay? He was a civilian and a leader of an anti-colonialist movement. In contrast, the founders of the modern Egyptian state were all military men. Okay, so in 1952, Egypt's monarch, a man named King Farouk, was overthrown. The head of the clique of officers that overthrew him was this man named Mohammed Naguib. It became evident very quickly that Mohammed Naguib was actually the front man, the unwitting and sad front man for junior officers who were led by this man, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and his crony Anwar al-Sadat. Military man, military man, military man, Anwar al-Sadat. So the president from 1952 to 54, 54 to 1970, 1970 to 81, and then he was succeeded by Hosni Mubarak, who was also a military man. So whereas in Tunisia, power, at least from 1957 to 1987, rested in the hands of a civilian, in the Egyptian case, the political leadership has always rested in the hands of the military. And so people naturally make the argument that this explains why Egypt's democratic transition came a cropper at the hands of the military, because the military was always used to being in charge in this country, and they were never going to reconcile themselves to any kind of legitimate democratic authority. And this is another chart showing sort of the same idea, basically showing how central the military is in Egypt and how peripheral the military is in Tunisia by a whole bunch of measures. How many members the armed forces have as per capita, how much money is spent on the military, etc. ad nauseum. Okay, and lots of scholars have actually made this argument going a long way back. So this is just one of many testimonials that I pulled up from 1985, which talks about how the Tunisian military is always very docile, quiescent, didn't get involved in politics, unlike its counterparts in places like Egypt or Syria, right? So for people who focus on the military, you may be able to make the argument that the divergent behavior of the Egyptian military and the Tunisian military is something that we could have predicted a long time ago, right? Because we knew that these two militaries were very different. I'm not sure this is true, and in the book we spend some time talking about this. The first point is that, yes, even though Tunisia's military was pretty small, so about 47,800 people, it's not as if Tunisia had no armed agents of the state who could have taken over, right? So in the Tunisian case, you have the Ministry of the Interior. That was the boot of the regime on the neck of the Tunisian people, and that had about 80,000 personnel. And by the way, before you say, well, the Ministry of the Interior never conducted military coups, that's how Zain al-Abidin bin Ali came to power. He was the head of the Ministry of the Interior, and he conducted a coup against our friend Habib Bourguiba. Okay, so there were these armed agents, maybe it's not the military, but there were certainly armed agents of the state that had, at some point in the Tunisian transition, as things were going badly, could have stepped in and tried to conduct a coup. So my view is that that can't really be the explanation. The other thing is, well, people say, well, you know, it's small, 80,000 people, the army, 40,000 people. They forget that in Egypt, when Egypt had its military coup in 1952, the size of the armed forces, the biggest estimate I can find, Egypt was 20 million people back then, 60,000, right? So you don't need to have a big army to have a military coup, right? So the point I'm trying to make here, by the way, is that I'm trying to make the argument that explaining why Tunisia didn't have a military coup requires us to do more than just look at the army. All right, or just look at the Ministry of the Interior, because all the conditions for a military coup were actually there as well. The other argument I would actually make, and we make this in the book, is that in fact, I think the military actually didn't have an incentive to overthrow Egypt's president. The military in Egypt actually didn't really want to do what they ended up doing in July of 2013. Now, this is a controversial claim, and every day produces new evidence to undermine this claim, unfortunately, but I'm going to stick with it. The main piece of evidence that I adduce for this claim is the constitution that the Muslim Brotherhood-dominated parliament passed in December of 2012. Okay? And this constitution had in it all kinds of guarantees for the political autonomy and supremacy of the military. Right? So this idea that the military was hyper-concerned about these democratically elected people suddenly infringing upon their prerogatives, subjecting them to some kind of civilian oversight, there's not really a whole lot of evidence that this was going to happen. If you look at the Constitution in 2012, it actually said that oversight of the military will rest with a body called the National Defense Council, and the National Defense Council will be dominated by military officers. The Minister of Defense is going to be the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and he can't be a civilian, he has to be a soldier, right? So there are all kinds of guarantees baked into this Constitution to say to the military, don't worry, okay? So I think the military was actually quite at ease with the Muslim Brotherhood being in power. There's also some evidence from the personal statement of the man who is Egypt's current president, General or Field Marshal Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. So in May of 2013, so this is shortly before the uprisings that caused the military to intervene and overthrow Mohamed Morsi, he's making a public speech and he's responding to the demand of quote-unquote liberal or quote-unquote secular opposition figures for the military to get involved and save us from these bad Muslim Brotherhood guys. And he says, listen, find a way to solve your problems. You don't want us to intervene. And there's a YouTube link I have here. He says, if the army comes out into the streets, it's over. Forget about Egypt for another 30 or 40 years, okay? Then he has this great Arabic saying, which I'd never heard before. He says, El-Gish Dinar. The army is fire, okay? ما تلعبش بيه وما تلعبش معاه. Means like, you don't play with it and you don't play against it. You know, it's like, don't mess with us. You don't want us. You think you want us, but you don't, okay? My view is that this is some evidence in favor of the fact that the army didn't really want to get back into the business of governing and wanted the Muslim Brotherhood and the opposition to come to some kind of modus vivendi, right? So that the political realm would be more or less stable because they were not worried about their prerogatives because, after all, they're baked into the Constitution. We know that that didn't happen, right? We know that instead what happened is that the Muslim Brotherhood and the opposition did not find a way to settle their differences, and that the opposition rose up in late June of 2013 in this quite spectacular rebel or tamarrud movement, which gathered by many accounts several million signatures and led to mass protests that, by all credible accounts, outweighed those that happened in Tahrir Square in 2011. Now, some Egyptians will say 33 million, some Egyptians will say 80 million. Every Egyptian man, woman, and child took to the streets. Some will say 160 million. They went multiple times. I don't know how big it was, but it was big, okay? And so this mass protest, okay, created the condition where the military had to intervene. The military had to oust Morsi in order to restore some kind of stability to the political realm. And remember, we've seen this movie before. They did exactly the same thing on February 11th, 2011. Right? So they did with Morsi what they had done with their godfather, Mubarak. And the reason they had to do it is because the political forces could not come to some kind of agreement, and consequently there was mass unrest and instability. So I'd say the difference between Egypt and Tunisia doesn't rest in the militaries. What was going on with the military, it really rests in understanding what happened among the politicians themselves. So in Tunisia, in contrast to Egypt, the politicians were actually able to come to some kind of agreement. They were actually able to come to some kind of modus vivendi and therefore avoid the mass protests of the magnitude that we saw in Egypt, right? And to me, that becomes the puzzle that we have to explain, right? Why is it that in the Egyptian case, the Muslim Brotherhood and its opponents could not come to agreement, and in the Tunisian case, they could, okay? And I promise I'm going to end very shortly. So there's a nice picture of Tunisia recently after they ratified their new constitution. And we make a pretty simple argument in this book about why it was that Tunisia went one way and Egypt went the other way. And the argument is basically best illustrated by looking at these two charts. So this is a chart of the distribution of seats in Tunisia's Constituent Assembly election. So October 2011, they elect their first quote-unquote parliament. This is also the body that's supposed to write the constitution. And the question is, and the result of this election, rather, was that an Islamist party called Ennahda won about 40% of the seats in the legislature. Okay, so remember the result of that election. We're all saying, "Oh, the Islamists are coming, the Islamist juggernaut." 40%. Keep that figure in your heads. This is the distribution of seats in Egypt's Constituent Assembly election a few months later. And here, Islamists also dominated, right? So this bar represents the seat share of the Freedom and Justice Party, right? They got almost 250 out of 500 and something seats. This represents the seat share of another party that was also Islamist, in fact, even more conservative, called Hizb an-Nur, or the Party of Light. So in Tunisia, Islamists get 40% of the seats. In Egypt, Islamists get 70% of the seats. Okay? So there was a huge imbalance in the political landscape, where Tunisia, the Islamists and their secular rivals, who were fragmented to be sure, but nonetheless, collectively, they were balanced. Whereas in Egypt, you had the big Islamist party, the Muslim Brotherhood, another rising Islamist party, the Salafists, the ultra-Orthodox Party of Light, and then these liberal secular no accounts who had very little in the way of representation. And my argument, or our argument in this book, is that this result is the proximate cause or the proximate explanation for why Tunisia goes one way and Egypt goes the other way. And I want to take us back to insight from a guy named Walter Lippmann, okay, who was, you know, sort of the Fareed Zakaria of his age. And Walter Lippmann made this very telling, very, very smart argument that political scientists didn't get around to making until the 1970s. He makes this argument in 1939, okay, in an article published in the Atlantic Monthly, where he says, for democracy to survive, you need a sufficiently even balance of power. Right? So that the government does not feel that it can be arbitrary, right? That it can run roughshod over everybody, right? And the opposition should not be revolutionary and irreconcilable, right? The idea here being if the government has a massive amount of power, then it's not going to compromise with its opponents. Why should I, right? And if the opposition is very weak and has very little power vis-a-vis the government, then, you know, what kind of compromise is there to be had? And the only path for us is revolution. And I think this even balance of power existed in Tunisia, right? The opposition in Tunisia, the liberal opposition in Tunisia, they saw that they got a majority of the vote in 2011. So they had no need to be revolutionary and irreconcilable. In fact, all they wanted was to get to another election because they had a high degree of certainty that if they got to another election, they'd actually do very well. The liberals, in contrast, in Egypt, did not want another election. In fact, Mohamed Morsi, the president of Egypt, guy I don't like at all, kept saying to them, hey, we should have a parliamentary election. The constitution says so. They didn't want that, right? Because they knew that compared to the Muslim Brotherhood and compared to the Salafists, both of whom had large ground operations, right? The liberal parties would have a hard time mounting political campaigns in every one of Egypt's 5,000 hamlets, right? Even finding candidates to run in every Egyptian electoral district would be hard, right? So because there was this uneven balance of political power, it became rational for the opposition in the Egyptian case to actually turn to protest and turn to the military to help undo for them what they could not undo at the ballot box, okay? So, okay, the question then becomes, well, why was there this different balance of power, right? Why was it that the Islamists dominated in Egypt and didn't dominate in Tunisia? This is a huge question. This is the big question. We answer it in the book. Okay, the book spent a lot of time on this, and I think it's actually one of our core contributions. But it's in our view, this is the question. This is what helps to explain why the Arab Spring survives in Tunisia. It's because they had pluralism, all right, that did not exist elsewhere. Okay, so let me sum up. So what are we doing in this book? You know, we're basically saying that the Arab Spring, if you look at most accounts of the Arab Spring, they're largely voluntaristic accounts, right? They talk about the courage and daring of activists, the machinations and mistakes of politicians and militaries. And we think that these have actually diverted our attention from much deeper structural factors, right? And so the answers to the questions that I posed here, we in the book find them in much deeper factors, much deeper structural and economic conditions that existed far prior to the uprisings and that help us explain why the uprisings ended up the way they did. And our big argument here is that we could have predicted how the Arab Spring would end even before it began. And we further make the argument that the best evidence suggests that the future of the Arab world is going to look a lot like its authoritarian past, except worse, right? Because at least during the authoritarian past, you had some modicum of state authority that protected people from the kind of Hobbesian war of all against all. Today, we don't really have that. To kind of sum this up even more succinctly, the argument that we're making in this book actually was made by Karl Marx many years ago, right? That men make their own history, but they don't make it as they please. They don't make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. And so that's what we do in this book. We spend a lot of time talking about the circumstances given and transmitted from the past that determine both whether uprisings began, whether regimes were able to withstand them, and whether there was a sufficient degree of pluralism, a sufficiently even balance of power to sustain democracy if you got it. Okay, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Good. Thank you, Tarek. I'm going to tell you, reading this book was like taking a very cold shower. And in that shower, I watched, as in the drain, every assumption I had made about the Arab Spring just washed out through that drain and was gone. And you've now heard a rapid-fire explanation of why I felt that way. What is not in the book, and I think one thing you've demythologized tonight, and I want to ask you, his name Bouzizi, the man who immolated himself in the village in Tunisia, which all of us have assumed was the spark that set it off. You said tonight you and your co-authors think that was not the spark. Was there a spark?
Well, you know, no. I mean, I don't know. There's a there were lots of self-immolations happening in the Arab world in this particular time. There was a case in Algeria prior to Bouazizi. After Bouazizi set himself on fire, several people did so in Egypt, right? It didn't trigger anything. There's a remarkable document, I believe it's an Al Jazeera interview. It's also available on YouTube. It's an interview of Munsif al-Marzouqi, who the head of the Congress for the Republic in Tunisia, one of Tunisia's larger opposition parties, not so much anymore. And he later, of course, became Tunisia's first democratically legitimated president. And he was interviewed a year before the Arab Spring began, and he described what happened in Tunisia to a T. He said, this is going to happen. There's going to be an uprising. The citizens are going to rise up and call for their rights. And the interviewer said, "Da hilm, this is a dream. We've heard this many times." And Marzouqi said, "It's not a dream, it's a plan." And of course, we know a year later the uprising took place. So I think that I don't want to say that the searing episode of Bouazizi's self-immolation was not important, but at best it was a spark that set off a already large collection of combustible material that was going to go off, and that folks were going to set off regardless.
Let me just ask you one last thing, and then I want to go to the audience to get comments and questions. You make a powerful case in the book and also in your statements here that the most determining factor in whether these uprisings will succeed or be completed or not is the existing social, economic, and political structure that was there before it all began. Looking at the Middle East and North Africa, those conditions don't exist in any single country. Does that mean that your prediction that the future will look like the past, only worse, can that not be reversed somehow? Is there not there are in this room tonight people who are practitioners, who are diplomats. Everybody here cares about the world, care about that region. Is there nothing, I don't mean we, this group, but is there nothing the outside world, or indeed the world within the Middle East, can do to reverse that sort of determinist conclusion that you've outlined so powerfully here?
Yeah, Warren, thank you for asking that question. So, I teach at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and I teach a course for our Master in Public Policy students. So if you get a Master in Public Policy, odds are you come through my course. And I tell them, I don't want you to be infected by my overwhelming pessimism and determinism, because if you end up looking at the world the way I look at the world, you'll never do anything, right? And, as people ask me, I want to change the world, what should I do? And in my more pessimistic modes, I quote a friend of mine who said, well, the only thing you can do in Egypt or in places that you really want to change is create some very small local version of the change you want to see in the world. So you want democracy in Egypt, you're never going to get it, but open a business and run it democratically, Now, I don't want to make that kind of pessimistic argument here, but I will say a couple of things. What we need to understand is that, getting democracy is hard, okay? It's a very hard thing. And the best evidence is that, you need a certain level of economic development, not necessarily because you need a citizenry who are enlightened enough to sustain democracy. I don't buy that. I've never bought that. But you do need, for example, a state that's actually competent, that's actually able to deliver policy, that's actually able to protect citizens, to create some degree of security. When you don't have that, the odds of getting democracy are very long. So, for example, a place like Libya, a place like Yemen, where the fundamental question there was always, how do we get a state? Forget about how that state's going to be governed. How do we actually have a competent state? I think that's where we need to focus our attentions in some of these places. Now look, if I were to say, what should we do? What should we do in order to promote democracy in the Middle East? I'd say, let's support the place that made the transition to democracy, right? Because Tunisia, even though it's a very tiny country, it's the size of a suburb of Cairo, not quite, but it's pretty tiny, 10 million people. Even though they've made their transition to democracy, that transition could absolutely come apart. Remember, the party that currently governs, that's the big party in Tunisia right now, Nidat Tunis, which has a lot of positive attributes, but one of its subtle kind of themes in its campaign was the restoration of Haybat al-Dawla. Right? The prestige of the state. And this is, speaks a little bit to some of the things I care about, right? Making sure you have a state that has capacity, but also Haybat al-Dawla has a darker meaning, right? The kind of dominance of the state. And what you don't want is a party like Nidat Tunis to regress into that old authoritarian discourse, right? And so what we need to do is we need to help deepen democracy in Tunisia. We need to help make sure that Tunisia's economy grows so that citizens don't become disillusioned with democracy. So my argument is, look, are we going to be able to make democracy happen in places like Libya or places like Yemen? I'd say probably not. Let's be humble about that. But where democracy has already happened, we could probably do a lot to help it take root. And that's where I think we should focus our attention.
Excellent. If you would, I'd love to get some comments and some questions. If you raise your hand, I'll call on you. Wait for the microphone to reach you, and please stand up and identify yourself. I'll start with the woman there. I'll do three at once there, and you'll be number two, and a third hand, Barbara, in the back.
Thank
and
you.
we'll answer three at once, okay?
Oh, okay.
So make notes.
Okay.
Proceed.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was very interesting. Two questions. One, if
Can you please identify yourself?
My name is Kira Jumay. I'm from Rutgers University. My first question is if you could speak a little bit about your data collection methods. It seems that you're using World Values and Freedom House, but was there any qualitative research, fieldwork on the ground? If you could discuss that a little bit. And my second question was, or maybe a comment, you were discussing the role of the Egyptian military and making the claim that the military did not want to get involved, but since the June 30th uprising, it has come out that Tamarud was corrupted by the military beforehand. In the week before, on the ground, I was doing field work at the time there, they said, people connected to the military said that they had already decided to support the protests. And in Doi, on June 30th, the police had signs, and they were standing outside the police station saying the people and the police are one hand. So I'd like you to discuss exactly where you're gathering the information.
That's a challenge, so we'll get you in a second. Well, I'd rather go to the other two people, and then we'll answer them all at once.
Hi there. Thank you so much for the presentation. James Reinl with Middle East Eye. It's a newsy question because this week there's a meeting in Washington, President Obama with members of the GCC countries, the heads of state from over there, the petro-monarchies of the Gulf, which showed no major signs, barring Bahrain, of Arab Spring revolts. Most of the analysts look at this in terms of the Iran deal and security and so on. I'm just wondering what observations you have on these important meetings in DC and Camp David.
And the last question, Barbara in the back. Right there. Yep.
Barbara Gibson, currently with the IPI on comment from the Canadian Foreign Ministry. Can you speculate a little bit about Tunisia's near future? We have a new draft legislation that's going to tighten up some terrorism laws. I understand post-Bardo that they have to deal with those kinds of issues, but is that control going back to the people you identified, the Interior Ministry, who are kind of dark and not so helpful in that transition to democracy? And speculate a little bit about how that might unfold.
Thank you. Tarek, answer those three, and we'll take three more.
Great, thank you. These are great questions. So in terms of data collection, so if you read the book, you'll see that we rely on several sources. First of all, myself, Jason, Andy Reynolds have traveled to all of these countries during the period of writing this book. Andy, for example, was involved in consulting on electoral law in Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen. I spent a lot of time in Egypt. I went to Tunisia. I didn't go to Yemen or Libya because of lack of state authority, and I have two little kids. If you are familiar with our work, you'll know that we are, particularly Jason and I, tend to be sort of, we collect original data. I've done, for example, multiple social and political surveys in Egypt. I do those. And the big innovation, I think, in this book that makes it very different from other Arab Spring books is that we use a lot of Arabic sources. So one of our frustrations is that lots of the literature on the Middle East, lots of the political science literature, and particularly lots of literature on the Arab Spring, if you read all of these Arab Spring books, there's very little reliance on Arabic language sources. And so we, based on our fieldwork, actually were able to collect a lot of Arabic sources, and I think we use them pretty effectively in the book. Now, you are making a powerful argument, and I actually conceded it when I made my case, when I said, here's what I'm saying about the Egyptian military, and every week there's new evidence to undermine my argument. And so the argument that you made is part of that. So I've said that the Egyptian military really had no interest in overthrowing Morsi. Recently, there have been these tapes that were released, okay, of unknown provenance. I don't even know if these tapes are authentic or not, but these tapes which purport to show that the military somehow was involved in channeling money from the United Arab Emirates to the Tamarrud movement. So it creates this impression that the protest movement that happened in Egypt in 2013 was a creation of the Egyptian military. I'm not sure that's true. Okay, I mean, even if you could make the case that elements of the military were involved in funding this protest movement, it doesn't negate the fact that there was this very important cleavage, this irreconcilable cleavage between the military and secular political leaders that goes back almost to the beginning, very, very shortly after Mohammed Morsi was elected, and that daylight that you saw between these two parties in Egypt is what allowed the military to get through it. As we say in the book, I don't know if I said it in this book or in my other book, but there was this gap between these two parties that was just big enough for the military to roll its tanks through. And the question you've got to ask yourself is, do we think that nothing similar was going on in Tunisia, right? Do we think that in Tunisia there was no meddling from the Interior Ministry or whatever to try to get people to go out into the streets to bring down this regime? I'm certain there was, right? But the fact is that the political elites in the Tunisian case, the non-Islamist political elites in the Tunisian case, understood that their future lay with elections. If they could just get to another election, they'd do pretty well. In the Egyptian case, the liberal elites knew that elections weren't going to end up very well for them. So that's where I think the key distinction is there. In terms of the Camp David meetings that are currently ongoing, I think your analysis of it is right, that it has a lot more to do with Iran. I think maybe the President of the United States wants to deliver a message to some of our allies in the Gulf, where I know there was this interview that President Obama did where he basically said, look, the big problem for our Gulf allies is not Iran, it's the citizenries of those countries that do not feel included, do not have opportunities, etc. And it may be that the President wants to deliver this message as well. The point about Tunisia, to speculate about Tunisia's near future, I don't want to do that. I was in Tunisia right after the Bardo massacre, and I can totally understand on a visceral level the need to combat terrorism. And we've seen lots of data suggesting that though Tunisia is the kind of bright spot of the Arab Spring, there are these dark undercurrents in that country. For example, some data, I don't know how reliable it is, tells us that one of the biggest suppliers of foreign fighters to ISIS is tiny little Tunisia. I don't know how true this is or not, but it suggests that there's this problem with Islamist violence that does require a strong state response, and the worry is that that could then bleed over or very easily give itself over to a kind of authoritarianism. I will say I was at this conference in Tunisia, and when people would learn that I was Egyptian, 9 times out of 10, they'd say, we love Sisi. You know, Sisi is great. And these are people from the president of Egypt. And these are people from across the socioeconomic spectrum in that country. So that suggests to me that this narrative of the need for a strong hand to restore order is a very powerful one in that new and fragile democracy.
Okay, we'll take a couple more. The gentleman there, the gentleman here, and this gentleman there. 1, 2, 3. I think that's going to be it. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you very much, Dr. Masoud. My name is Sifala Kandil from the Egyptian Mission to the United Nations. We haven't met for a couple of years now. I have a very brief question. Thank you very much for your attempt to try to portray or capture a very complex
My
picture.
successful attempt. No, go ahead.
But my question is about the future of political Islam. Many people in Egypt and in the Arab world see what's happening, what happened in Egypt in the last couple of years as the end of political Islam. The current state of affairs resorting to violence, what's happening in Sinai, and definitely ISIS is considered by many as signs that political Islam is going unpopular, extremely unpopular. I listened carefully to what you mentioned, and I didn't see anything related to political Islam. Maybe it's in the book and you didn't have time to explain it. So if you can tell us a little bit about this. Thank you.
Excellent. And Jeffrey?
The second and larger question I wish that you might address, since it didn't come up at all in this discussion, was the role of the international community in having created expectations about democracy and democratization being the natural endpoint for political development. The UN development programs, Arab development reports had emphasized democratization as voices from the Arab world rather than George Bush's. George Bush himself, of course, had made this a major, if tainted, issue. Obama, when he was still riding high, had in speeches in Cairo and elsewhere promoted it. And it is perhaps not a coincidence that the two countries where you at least got to legitimate elections were the two in which there was a strong Western kind of involvement, Tunisia and Egypt. What was the role of the international community? What is it as these currents or floods go rushing past?
Okay, and then the final question, and then we're going to wrap it up because I want to give you time to talk to people and buy books. Who was? Yeah, there you go. Very good. And please identify yourself.
Hi, Randolph St. Ledger. Just wanted you to talk about the role of women in the participation of Arab Spring, and then the success and failure of the democracies and women's roles in Tunisia and also in Egypt, and how that translated into the success of Tunisia versus Egypt.
All good questions.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful set of questions. So the first question about political Islam, it seems remarkable to me that anybody at this particular moment in our history could make the argument that political Islam is over when, in fact, Islamists control what is the largest state in the Levant, right? ISIS is now the largest state in the Levant. So for me, my concern is not the end of political Islam. It is the mutation of political Islam into this very virulent form that we observe with ISIS. There's a main reason I didn't talk about political Islam is because my other book that came out last year was about, has all the answers to your questions. I encourage you to buy it. I think that, but I do want to answer your question here. So I think that in the Egyptian case, is political Islam over? If political Islam is defined as the imperative to legislate pieces of the religion, the imperative to have Islam inform the policies of governments, then I think that isn't dead, right? I would in fact even go further and say that even Egypt's current regime pays lip service to this idea that Islam should somehow inform everything we, inform our lives. Although I would also make the argument and recognize Egypt's current president for actually doing some very important and much needed work to limit the role of Islam. I mean, he's the first president I can think of who said in an interview view that people should be allowed to become Muslim, be non-Muslim, whatever they want. So I do want to give President Sisi credit for that. But the big point I want to make is political Islam as this big idea, is it over? No. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood, which was the sort of spearhead of political Islam in Egypt, is that over? Certainly, I would say in its present form, it is. And I don't see how it would come back. People have made the argument, of course, that the Muslim Brotherhood has been down and out before. After 1954, the Muslim Brotherhood was hounded out of political life, and yet, lo and behold, 16, 17 years afterwards, they were back. But of course, they were only able to come back because the state, the president of Egypt, extended his hand to the Islamists, polished them up, and let them back into political life. And of course, the Islamists also had powerful international patrons in the Gulf. Today, none of that exists, right? The former patrons of political Islam in Saudi Arabia, they are entirely opposed to, well, not entirely anymore, but they are opposed certainly to the Muslim Brotherhood. So I think the Muslim Brotherhood's position is extremely weak, and I can see that organization basically shrinking or dying. I certainly don't see it as a potential claimant on political power in Egypt in the foreseeable future.
We're running out of time, so I'm going to authorize you to ignore Jeffrey Laurenti's first question, because the second question is the one I want to hear the answer to. Why the expectations of the outside world, the UN?
But his first question was the more damaging.
I'm
to my
just worried about
thesis.
the time.
So I'll get both of his questions. So Jeffrey's question was, look, I've made the argument that liberals were hopeless at elections, and Jeffrey's saying, well, why did they feel so hopeless, given that they, Morsi almost lost the presidential election? And so that allows me to make an argument in my other book. In fact, the liberals, their position I had to caricature here because we didn't have a lot of time. And when I got here, he saw that I had 79 slides and he freaked out. But basically, the liberals didn't quite say we don't want an election. They said we don't want a parliamentary election, which was what was on the calendar. The parliamentary election was what was constitutionally mandated. They said we want a presidential election because they knew all they needed to do was pick one guy who could be the focus of popular anger against the Muslim Brotherhood and Mohammed Morsi. That guy could win the presidency, and then they'd get to. But of course, the Islamists, knowing that and knowing that the Constitution was on their side, said, no, the Constitution says parliamentary elections. The Islamists bet that they had the ground game to do well in those elections, and the liberals didn't. And there I say, so it was really a disagreement about what kind of elections to have, and that was the proximate disagreement. So thank you for allowing me to say that. The point about the outside world and the role that the outside world played, I think this is an important question. Remember, when Hosni Mubarak looked like he was on the ropes. He made a speech in beginning of February 2011, that was a very moving speech, I think, where he talked about his long history of service to Egypt. He promised the young people in Tahrir that he was not going to stand for re-election that September, that he was going to leave. And many people that I know who had participated in the Tahrir protests, people in my family, said to me that they actually felt, khalas, this, let the old man serve out. Let's not humiliate him. And then there were, the following day, some acts of violence in Tahrir Square, the so-called Battle of the Camel, in which like 3 or 4 guys on some camels and horses tried to beat people in the square. They were, of course, beaten themselves. But the point is, the optics of it in the United States didn't look good. And very quickly, the president of the United States said, a transition in Egypt needs to happen and needs to happen immediately. And lots of people, including myself, were saying this. We're saying that that's it. This regime will not stick to its promises. It has to go, etc. So I do think that we did play a role in limiting the potential for some kind of negotiated outcome to that early protest, where Mubarak could have lingered on, the Constitution of Egypt could have been preserved, and you could have had some evolutionary path rather than a revolutionary path. So I do think outside actors played a role there. I think they played no role, though, in Tunisia. I think, and that's so that at least tells me that the role of outside actors is maybe not determinative.
The role of women.
The role of women, that is an essential question, and it's such a broad question. The role of women in the protests, the role of women in the post-protest era, the role of women in elections. Here's what I would say. I would tell you that, I look for indicators of political health. And the best indicator of the health of a polity, in my view, is the role and status of women. And you could have predicted very early on that Tunisia was going to go pretty well, because by gosh, when it came time to make rules about women and about women's participation in politics, they did things that in the context of the Arab world are kind of revolutionary. So for example, in Tunisia, they had an electoral system for their constituent assembly that established what we call a zipper, right? That on your electoral lists, the seats had to alternate between men and women. Your nominees had to be woman, man, woman, man, or man, woman, right? In the Egyptian case, we tried to do something like that. There was great disagreement about it. So consequently, what the law stipulated was that your list, your electoral list in the elections, has to have a woman on it. So therefore, parties would find a woman, like the Salafist party would put a woman at the bottom of the list, so she would never get elected, and they wouldn't even deign to print her picture. They would print the picture of a flower or the logo of the party. Okay? So right there is an indicator of how different these two polities are. And going all the way back to what I tried to tell you here about circumstances inherited from the past, that is, that difference in the way that Tunisians empower women versus the way that Egyptians disempower them, we endogenize that to some longue durée historical factors, and I hope you'll open the book to find out what those are.
It is true that when Tarek told me he had 75 slides, which I only learned this afternoon, I did sort of freak out, and Tarek said, "Don't worry, I talk fast." You have seen an example of that. In that fast talk is an awful lot of substance. The book is more of it. I recommend the book. Now is the time to buy it if you want to buy it. I'm going to keep Tarek here to sign those books and have a chat with you, and just ask you to join me in thanking you for that wonderful disposition.
Thank you. Thank you.